Hi everyone, welcome to the last part of our lecture on abstractness in phonological representations. Now that we've worked through case studies involving Spanish and Turkish data, we can discuss some further issues with possible abstract analyses. And of course, with any part of phonology, since phonological analysis is in fact concerned with describing the psychological system of sounds of speakers, we should ask ourselves, is there really psychological reality to such abstract analyses? And a number of phonologists quite reasonably object that trying to work out such abstract analyses is really just a sort of game, that it's not reasonable to think that sounds like an underlying obstruent without specification for voicing could possibly be part of the phonological system that could be acquired by children. And as far as I've seen, there's not really any psycholinguistic evidence to support abstract underlying representations, though the fact is that there hasn't yet been a lot of psycholinguistic evidence really trying to explicitly look into the question of abstract underlying representations. Now, we haven't in this course discussed a model or algorithm of how children determine what the underlying representations for morphemes should be, but we can reasonably think that it would substantially reduce the number of hypotheses that a child has to make if the underlying form has to be one of the surface allomorphs that actually occurs. So if the underlying allomorph in Turkish or Spanish needed to be one of the surface allomorphs, then there's just a choice of one of two possibilities. But if the surface allomorph can really be anything whatsoever, then there's a potentially infinite search space, computer scientists would say. Let's keep in mind, though, that we have seen cases, like back in the fourth week in data from Tonkawa, where there were stems that surfaced. All of their surface forms were somewhat different from the underlying representation that would need to be posited. So we could add a further principle that it could be at least helpful to say that an underlying form should include only sounds that are observed in some surface allomorph. So remember the Tonkawa case involved vowel alternations. So say, for instance, the allomorphs were something like ketuf and katf. There, if a stem had these two allomorphs, then through some sort of vowel syncope rule, as we applied in Tonkawa, we could explain where vowels are deleted and say, okay, the underlying representation for this stem can be something that only contains segments that are there in the surface form. And since we see alternations in vowels, and u with nothing, we can posit an underlying representation, katuf, and depending upon what prefixes or suffixes are added, then different vowels may be subject to deletion. And the ultimate point here with respect to abstract underlying representations is that if a child in acquisition has to consider the possibility of underlying representations that contain sounds that are not seen in any of the allomorphs, or even seen in any words of the language whatsoever, then the job becomes harder, if not impossible. So, and let's even keep in mind that the analysis of Turkish that we've carried out today here is not even quite so extreme as the abstract analyses for Polish and English that you can read about in your textbook. It still requires some intuition, or almost a leap of faith on the part of the child. And that Polish analysis involving the alternations of years, vowels that sometimes surface as different vowels in some contexts and which don't occur as any sound whatsoever in other contexts, are very abstract. And it would be difficult, I think, in the Turkish case, or sorry, the Polish case, which has a similar we find similar phenomena in many other Slavic languages. It would be difficult to, I think, for phonologists to even have arrived to the idea of using such abstract analyses for the synchrony of the language without knowing something about the earlier history of the language, where we know that there were certain vowels that were lost in some contexts but became other vowels in other contexts. And as we talked about last week, it's of course the case that children don't know anything about the history of the language. They certainly don't know anything about the language as it was spoken 500 or 1,000 years ago. So we want to make sure that the synchronic analyses that we posit are based upon the concrete information that is available to the children. And moreover, there is, I think, increasing evidence in recent years that data which would require an extremely abstract analysis can result in phonological change or morphological regularizations. So in the end, this suggests that probably the abstract analyses of this sort are not something that children, that language learners are really able to carry out. These are sort of fun and interesting problems for us as linguists, as phonologists, to think about. And it's involves some creative problem solving to be able to play the game, so to say, of deriving the pronounced forms from some kind of underlying representation. But if our objective is really to describe the psychological sound system, then by operating in this fashion, we are probably getting away from, we're probably actually getting farther away from that real goal, from the real purpose of phonology as a field. So let's then consider then, if the abstract analysis is probably not the correct theoretical direction, what sort of alternatives could we take in order to try to handle cases like the Spanish and Turkish problems that we've encountered today? Well, for Spanish, an alternative might be to use some of the kinds of diacritic rule specifications that we've seen in the past weeks. So let's say that we adopt the monophthongization analysis. That was the first analysis that we thought would work. So we posit for verbs like that show the alternation, negamos, niego, as having the underlying diphthong, which becomes monophthongized when unstressed. And then we can mark the non-alternating forms, the forms that consistently maintain the diphthong, the forms like diezmar, to decimate, as having a special feature that says they are not subject to monophthongization. And that's not so unreasonable, because these data, the forms that contain the diphthong, regardless of whether it is stressed or not, are the least frequent type in the Spanish lexicon. So there are a lot of verbs that show the alternation, and there are a lot of verbs which contain the monophthong that don't alternate, but verbs that have the diphthong throughout the paradigm are comparatively infrequent. So we could simply assert that then a root like diezmar, like the root of like yes, that this is marked as minus monophthongization. So just in the same way that we suggested, for instance, in other analyses that fail to undergo a productive rule. So in our exercise session, when we looked at Finnish cases, we saw that there are some loanwords that were not subject to the process of vowel shortening. So those two loanwords could be marked as minus vowel shortening, since they constitute just a few exceptions. And in the Turkish case, we can do something similar. There, we could assume that final obstruent devoicing is a productive rule of the language, is a productive rule. And then we mark the stems that fail to undergo word final devoicing as exceptions. So in that case, words like stems like kanad would have an underlying voice stop, which becomes voiceless. But then there would be other stems like balad, which also have an underlying voice stop, but which are marked as minus word final devoicing. And in that way, the voiced stop is preserved. So in effect, the alternative to these abstract analyses is to have recourse to lexical information, to further lexical specifications of which stems, which morphemes are supposed to undergo certain phonological processes, and which stems or morphemes are not will not undergo those processes. And this analysis of Turkish using final obstruent devoicing has sort of been the spirit of more recent analyses of the same problem. Basic idea, again, there is that there's a class of lexical exceptions that is allowed to have voiceless stops pronounced in word final position, even though voiceless obstruents word finally in Turkish would, on the whole, be dispreferred. So let's summarize what we've discussed today. So data like those we've seen from Turkish and Spanish, or the analyses of Polish and English that you can read about in your textbook, seem to call for so-called abstract underlying forms, which could be composed in part from different surface allomorphs. That's even going farther than the cases in Tonkawa, where we put together an underlying representation out of different parts of different allomorphs that never all occur together. And what was really definitional or characteristic of these abstract underlying representations is that they result in assuming a sound that never actually occurs on the surface in the language. But as we discussed, the fundamental issue is that these sorts of analyses from the point of view of language acquisition seem quite improbable. And it's hard to see how children could arrive to such analyses, and examples from language change, from phonological change, suggest that when the data becomes too opaque, unclear, that children can't acquire the system anymore whatsoever. Good, okay, so after this slight detour into what is probably a dead end, so to say, in terms of the real goals of phonology as a field, next week we will turn to a more productive line of inquiry by talking about syllables, by adding structure and divisions between the individual sounds and segments of the language. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy your week.